I'm Audrey Foster with Nebraska Extension in Custer County, and I'm their summer employee. Today is one of 2 days that we're going to be focusing on dyeing. Today, we're going to be working with solar dyeing, and this technique is similar to sun tea. If you think about sun tea, you put all your ingredients for the tea into a pot or a glass pot and then put it in the sun. And as it sits in the sun, it starts to the water takes the flavor of the tea. And we're going to be doing something similar with our fabric. We're going to be using the energy of the sun to dye our fibers. So, before we get started, I want to go over a few basic things that we should all know about dyeing. Safety. One of the big things with safety is make sure you're wearing old clothes when you are doing this, because you don't want to accidentally stain some of your good clothes. Another thing with safety is we're going to be working with natural dyes, but this doesn't necessarily mean that they're all not toxic. The dyes I've chosen for us to experiment are not toxic, but keep in mind that as you really start to explore natural dyes, some of them can be, such as rhubarb. I mean, we eat the stems of rhubarb in pie and muffins and all sorts of other things, but the leaves that you use to dye with are very toxic. So after you dye with rhubarb, you can no longer use those pots for kitchen use. So just make sure that you're being very conscious of what you're using as dye materials and the pots and different cooking equipment and dyeing equipment you're using while you work with these ingredients. But everything that we use throughout this workshop is going to be not toxic in the quantities we're working with. Also, keep in mind that we're going to be working with lots of hot materials and hot water. So if you need a parent's help, please ask for it, because your safety is our first and foremost concern. Next up, we make sure that you're using the right fibers. You want all your fibers that you're dyeing with to be natural, or things such as cotton, wool, silk, or linen. You want to use natural fibers because they absorb dye more readily than synthetic fibers, such as polyester, acrylic, and nylon. I like to use 100% wool, but 100% cotton also works pretty well. This will also depend on what type of material you're using to dye your fibers. Some call for one or the other, and a lot of the different materials we'll be using to dye fabric over the next 2 days, you can use either wool or cotton. It just depends on what you have and what you're willing to work with. Also, as we go through this, we're experimenting, we're trying new things. So make sure you keep a journal of what you tried and what you did, so that in case you want to go back and change it up and try something new next time, you know what you did to then build off of. Another thing to keep in mind is, even though we're working with plant materials and we're going out to collect them, how they behave at this point in the year in the summer is going to be different than how they behave in the fall. So as you're doing this, your colors may change at different points in the year, and this could be something cool to note in your journals as you're working with natural dyes. But anytime you're working with natural dyes, make sure that you're being conscious of how you're harvesting these materials, and make sure that you're being responsible as well. Such as, nettles and dandelions are commonly looked at as weeds, so it's pretty easy to collect those. But you'd want to make sure and ask your neighbor before you go harvest all their marigold flowers to dye with. So just make sure that you're being conscious. Also, the dandelions and nettles, at least where I'm at, they're a weed, so it's okay if we take a whole bunch of the plant. But you only want to harvest 1/3 of the plant if you're wanting to save the plant. Also, another thing, as we're experimenting with all this stuff, make sure you do your research before going out and doing natural dyes. Such as, you may want to watch this video more than once to make sure that you get the concepts and know what you're doing. I also like to consult various books and websites. DharmaTrading.com does a really good job as far as discussing the science behind natural dyes and giving ideas for different chemicals and everything. But there's also a few books that I've been reading as well as I work on this, such as A Garden to Dye For has been a really good resource, and it talks about planting a garden specifically for dyeing fabric, which is something that I think is pretty cool. There's also one called Wild Color that I think is really good too, and it gives more specific instructions as far as how to dye stuff, because we're just going to be sampling the natural dyeing world throughout this workshop. There's so much more out there, and these give good recipes as far as how to dye stuff. Also, this video is not the end-all be-all. This is just my own experimentations, and not everything was necessarily successful for me, but it may be for you. So much can change between how everyone measures chemicals or even what kinds of fibers we use to dye. So today we're going to be working with solar dyeing, as I mentioned, and for this we are going to be using onion skins. And so here is my sample of onion skin fabric that I dyed, and then I also tried working with chili powder, but it didn't quite turn out like I planned it. It's still pretty light, but that's okay. As you work with natural dyes, they're unpredictable, and part of the fun of it is you don't know quite how they're going to end up. For instance, I had no idea that onion skins would look like this, but due to the combination of onions I used, this is the color I got. So make sure that you have fun and try stuff, and even though not everything will work out as planned, that doesn't mean you still can't learn stuff and have fun throughout the process. I look forward to going along through this journey with you. For this type of dyeing, I'm gonna do solar dyeing. So what we're gonna do first is I'm gonna peel these onions, and I'm gonna put the peels into my jar with water, and then I'm gonna let it sit outside in a sunny spot for 2 days so that my dye bath can formulate. The first type of dyeing I'm gonna be doing is solar dyeing. And so for this, I have my giant jar that I can use and sit outside for about 4 days. For 2 days, I'll have it out with my plant materials and water to create the dye. And then for the next 2 days, I'll have it in the sun to dye my fabric. So for this, you want to make sure that you have a whole bunch of sunny days lined up if you want to do solar dyeing. However, you can also do a cold bath or a hot bath, depending on your materials. Also, one thing that I like about solar dyeing is that it's more sustainable, as in we're not having to use heat from our kitchen or stove to try and heat the fibers. I can use it from the sun, and I mean, this next week is all 90-degree days, so it's perfect. Might as well get some good out of all that heat. So first off, with our as we're gonna be doing solar dyeing, the first step for using onion skins is to collect some onions. And if you have these from your garden, that's great. But if you don't, you're like me, you can always go to the grocery store. So I've gone ahead and gotten a whole bunch of onions. And what I'm gonna do is, okay, before we begin, depending on what color you want to get, you can choose different kinds of onions. Where I'm just experimenting, I'm gonna try a little bit of both. But you guys can use what you would like. It just depends on your preferences. But I really wanna see what happens when I combine both. So what I'm gonna do is, I'm just going to take the peels from the outside and put them into the jar. And then I don't necessarily want the roots, so I'm gonna go ahead and cut those off, and then I'll just peel some of the outside layers into it. Now that I've got my onion skins all into a jar, I'm gonna go ahead and fill it with water. Okay, I'm gonna need a tiny bit more water here. Now we're also going to do another method of solar dyeing. So I have another jar here. This one's a little bit smaller, but we're going to go ahead and try it. And for this type of dyeing, keep in mind that you can use stuff that's already in your kitchen, such as spices. Some of these include turmeric, curry, or paprika, or as we're going to use, chili powder. So how we're going to mix up this dye is I have my measuring cup here, and I'm going to measure out 1 cup of water. Okay, so after you have your 1 cup of water, you're gonna measure out 2 ounces or 1/4 a cup of chili powder, or whichever spice that you choose to use. Then, after you've measured out your 1/4 a cup, you're gonna go ahead and dissolve it in the cup of water. One of the nice things about using spices from your kitchen is they're already in tiny, tiny little pieces. So you don't have to try and fish out the remnants of leaves or flowers or anything like that before you go and put your fiber into your jar or container. Okay, after it's good and mixed, you're gonna go ahead and pour it into your jar. Then we're gonna go ahead and fill our jar up with water. Depending on the size of your container and the amount of fabric you have, you may want to do a couple of those batches of like dye and hot water, but you don't necessarily have to, and I think for this size of thing, I'll be good. But here again, you just gotta experiment and try stuff. Now that I have this filled with dye, I'm gonna go ahead and put my lid on, wrong lid, and now it's ready to be sat in the sun. Now that my jars are all ready to go, we're gonna go find a sunny spot for them outside. Now I found a spot that it can stay in the sun, and I'm gonna leave it here for 48 hours. So our first step is to make sure that our fabric that we are gonna be using, I'm gonna be using 100% cotton fabric, is free of any grease, oils, or finishes that the companies could possibly put onto the fabric. So what we're gonna do first is I'm going to put my fabric in a bath of water for about 1 hour. And for this bath, I have filled a pot up with water, and then I'm gonna be using Synthropol, which is a professional textile detergent. And this kind of just really helps to strip away all the foreign materials from the fibers that could prohibit them from dyeing as we want them to. So I have my water here, and I'm gonna put about a teaspoon of Synthropol, or our textile detergent, into the water. Okay, after that's in the water, what we are going to do is we're gonna take our fabric. At this point, you'll want to have pre-cut it, and also it could be a good idea at this time to weigh it so that you know how much dye material you need to use. And for mine, I have 2 different sizes. I have 1/2 yard for one of my samples, the onion skins, and then I have a 1/4 yard for my chili powder or my spice. You guys can use whatever sizes of fabric you want. These also just happen to fit well within my containers, so that's what I kind of went with there too. Also, this is my first time dyeing with these 2 ways, so I don't necessarily want to do 4 yards of fabric to find out that, you know, this didn't really work this first time, or, you know, I really don't care for that color. So remember that you can always go back and dye more, so it can be better to start with less and then build up to more. However, it's also nice when your samples are good sizes, because you never know how well you might want to test your samples, such as you may want to dye it and then test to see if the color stays on it when you run it through the dishwasher. Or you could hang a swatch outside, or a swatch is a small square of fabric, and to see if it fades in the sun. And I mean, you can test all sorts of things, so more is better when you're making samples. So now that I have my Synthropol or textile detergent in my water, I'm gonna go ahead and just submerge my 2 pieces of fabric. And then I'm gonna turn my oven on, and for this, I want my water to reach between 140 and 160 degrees Fahrenheit. Once it reaches that point, I will turn off my oven and let it just cool down for 1 hour. Now that it's reached the correct temperature, between 140 and 160 degrees Fahrenheit, I've turned off my stove, and I'm just gonna let it cool down here for 1 hour. So as I mentioned, I'm using 100% cotton fabric here today. The type of fiber you use, or the kind of material you use, does matter when you're dyeing. You wanna stick with cellulosic or protein fibers. These include things such as silk and wool, which are protein fibers because they come from animals, spiders, and either goats' wool or rabbits, or I mean, there's all sorts of different types of wool. Or else cellulosic includes different things such as cotton or linen. And we want to stick with these natural fibers because they absorb dye and pigments really, really well, which is what we're after in this instance. You do not want to try and dye fabrics that are man-made, such as polyester, nylon, acrylic. Anything that's manufactured like that will not take dye readily, and you're not going to be able to dye it. So therefore, you want to stick with natural fibers. I Protein fibers dye really, really well, but they can also be a little more expensive. So that's where cotton comes in nicely, even though it doesn't necessarily take dye quite as readily as your silk or wool. Next up, we've got to add our mordants to our fibers. The mordants just really help to brighten our colors and also to make the color stick better so that it won't fade as much in the wash and in the sun. So the two types of mordants that we're using today are going to be alum and cream of tartar. Both of these can be found in your kitchen and aren't necessarily toxic when we use them in the quantities we're using them in. But still, you may want to get an adult's help when you're measuring these out. So, for the quantities of these, this is where it's important that you weighed your fabric before you got it wet. For every 1 pound of dry fabric or fibers you have, you want to use 1.75 teaspoons of alum and 1 teaspoon of cream of tartar. So here I've gone ahead and gotten my pot where I'm going to be measuring these, and I've got my alum, and I have, let's see, here is my alum, and then my cream of tartar. This is a good time to note that the pH of your water will make a difference. pH is the measure of how acidic or basic your water is. If it's too acidic or too basic, it can affect the color, sometimes for the better or for the worse. So if your results don't turn out quite as planned, it may be worth it to check the pH of your water. And this can be done with simple home testing kits. And we want those to get stirred in nicely. Remember that the types of pots you use while dyeing can also make a difference. I'm using stainless steel pots because they will not react with the various dye and chemicals we're using. However, iron, copper, or even aluminum pots will react, which can be cool if that's the effect you're going for, but you also don't want to use one of your good pots and have them react and make the pot then therefore unusable for kitchen use. So just be conscious of what you're using. I like to use stainless steel. So once our chemicals have been mixed around and dissolved, it doesn't matter how much water you put these into as long as your fabric will be totally submerged, because all the chemicals within your pot will be absorbed by your fabric by the time you take it out. Okay, so I've gone ahead and wrung out my fabric, and then I'm just gonna place this in this water. I am gonna simmer my fabric in here for 1 hour. If you're using wool fibers, it's very important that you do not boil them because it can cause fiber shock and cause the fibers to really mat and become undesirable. However, we're using cotton, so it's a little less finicky, but at the same time, you wanna make sure that it's just at a simmer. Once again, as we're working with a stove and hot ingredients, it may be beneficial to have your parents help if you don't feel comfortable with this. As our fabric is finishing up in the mordant, we can go ahead and take our jar of onion skins and go ahead and pull out all the onion skins. We want to go ahead and leave as much of the dye bath as possible, so be careful just to grab the onion skins. The amazing thing about dyeing with spices is that as the spices are already ground into tiny little pieces, we don't have to remove anything from the container before we put in our fabric. So as soon as our fabric is done in the mordant, we can go ahead and unscrew it, put our fabric in, and put it in the sun. At this point, I'm just going to transfer my fabric to the appropriate jar. So I'm going to start out with my chili powder. And I'm just gonna grab my fabric, and then we're just gonna lower it into our dye. Gonna go over. Uh-oh. What's that? Uh-oh. If you filled it a little bit full, we'll just have to dump a little into the sink. Now I've secured the lid back onto my container, and I'm gonna go set it in the sun for 2 days. Next, I'm gonna move the fabric for my onion skins into the onion skin dye bath. So I'm just letting some of the extra water drip here, and then we're gonna move it right into this container. And as this is solar dyeing, at this point we'll move them into the sun and we don't have to mess with them then for 2 days. We also don't have to worry about heating the fibers either, which saves on energy. So now that I have my fabric into my dye bath, I'm just going to close up the lid and I'm going to move it into the sun for 2 days. As my fibers have now finished up in the sun, I'm going to go ahead and rinse them out. I'm just going to rinse them out under the hydrant and using a little bit of my Synthropol or professional textile detergent. After the fibers have been rinsed out, they can be line dried. So now that you've finished up your natural dyeing, what kinds of things did you learn? Did anything surprise you? I know that as I look around my yard now, I think about all the different plants and I wonder what kind of colors each of the different materials would make. For instance, we have some blackberries that are starting to grow and everything, and I'm starting to wonder what color those could make, or even what color their leaves could make. And the great thing is, there's all sorts of different internet and book resources I can use to go and find out how to use these various materials to dye with. So now that we've kind of started exploring the world of natural dyes, I look forward to seeing what you guys come up with, and hopefully you guys will be interested in this as well. Have fun, and I look forward to seeing your results. You cannot use salt. The pH level, or the level of acidity and base, Jamie? What? pH level, what's the best 30-second explanation of it? It's just the measure of how acidic or basic something is, right?
Yeah. Maybe it's acidity.
Yeah, okay. Also, now I've secured the jar back onto my container. Now I've secured the lid back onto my container, and